What if the things you thought you knew about your favorite TV stars were not true? What if there was betrayal, trickery, and murder going on behind the smiles, jokes, and million-dollar deals? Mike Wolfe just broke down in court and pointed the finger at Rick Harrison, not as a foe or a friend, but as the person who brought down Frank Fritz. This isn't just a TV show anymore. This is real. This is dangerous. And now the truth is out. There are times in court that you think will be routine, even mechanical. The wheels of justice move forward as judges shuffling papers and lawyers reading statements. Defendants sit still. On the other hand, there are days when all rules, manners, and legal decorum are quickly forgotten. Today was that. Please click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell to get updates before we go on. Mike Wolfe, who had a beard and was good for cameras on American Pickers and was known for his cool charisma and Midwestern charm, stood shaking in front of a full courtroom and couldn't finish his statement. His voice was weak and his hands were shaking. The judge had to ask the crowd to be quiet twice because everyone gasped. He killed Frank. Mike said, Rick Harrison killed him because he was the one. No one moved. The stenographer's keys stopped for a beat, too. In that one moment, those 10 words turned the room from tense excitement to complete chaos. It wasn't just a play on words or a courtroom scene. One reality TV star accused another of murder in public and under oath. It broke up a friendship, changed the meaning of death, and was a show for the whole country. It wasn't just a judicial fight over royalties or contracts. No, this was a huge blow to my feelings. There was evidence that cut through a web of lies, denials, and carefully crafted TV personas. Mike Wolfe didn't just say someone was guilty. Fans have been whispering about this secret for years, and he solved it. What did Frank Fritz really do? The man that everyone thought was healing from a stroke in private, possibly in rehab or therapy, may not be alive after all. Even worse, he may have been killed, and the charges. Rick Harrison was the founder of pawn shops. Many people thought he was a smart businessman, but until now, no one thought he was a killer. Let's go back in time before we talk about what caused this fight in court. We need to look back at the shows that made them famous to understand why Mike broke down today and couldn't keep Rick's secret any longer. Back to the business deals, egos, and betrayals. Back to the times we thought were real, but may have actually been carefully planned lies. To begin with, it looked like two different empires were growing on cable TV. There was more to American Pickers and Pawn Stars than just TV shows. They were artistic events. One looked at America's lost riches. The other looked at how much people thought their valuables were worth. There were guys at the center of both shows who made a living by knowing what things were worth and maybe even how much people were worth. There was a time when Mike Wolfe and Frank Fritz's backroad adventures through barns and junkyards made people laugh. They were the sweetest pair of old things. At the gold and silver pawn shop, Rick Harrison kept Las Vegas going with his sarcastic wit and smart deals. Different ways, but the same results. Real, life TV stars who didn't need lines were in their prime. They had to buy, sell, and bargain over things. We thought that was all. Fans began to notice something odd in 2021. On American Pickers, Frank wasn't there. At first there was only one show, then two, and finally a whole season. Official comments were not clear. Health problems, personal time, and getting better. But there were reports. Was he fired? Did he quit? Did you have a grudge against Mike? Frank himself spoke out once and said some general negative things about the show, implying he wasn't being treated fairly. Then there was quiet. The network didn't say much as Frank's absence got worse. Mike didn't say much, but something was going on behind the scenes. There is something darker going on than any executive news release could ever say. Mike said in court today that he had been afraid of that for too long. The worry that Frank hadn't just been pushed out, but shut up for good. Mike finally broke after years of being tormented inside. He told the judge that every time he saw a rusty truck or a dirty sign, it made him think of Frank, but not in the way that fans might think. No, his mind was full of ghosts, He said in his sleep on the stand, "I should have gone with him that day. He shouldn't have met Rick, and I should have stopped him." What meeting, what day, what took place? Some people who are close to the case say that Mike and Frank were asked to join a special crossover special with the Pawn Stars team in early 2021. It was a history of negotiation style event. Mike is said to have said no, but Frank said yes to Rick's secret offer to meet in Vegas and talk business. Reports say that was the last time someone outside of Rick's group saw Frank awake and healthy. Frank was taken to the hospital right away after a few days. The official word is stroke. Mike wasn't sure, though. The timetable didn't make sense. For some reason, phone logs were erased. Frank's last known text message to Mike was, "If anything happens to me, it wasn't the stroke." It was chilling, scary, and hard to believe until today. Mike told the judge that he had been getting anonymous texts for the past year. Each one gave a hint that Frank's stroke might have been caused. One message said, "Rick knows, so does Chumley, you didn't hear it from me." Another message had a blurry picture of Frank lying down in what looked like the pawn shop's back office, a long time before he was taken to the hospital. But Mike didn't say anything because he didn't want to believe it. They knew each other and sometimes even became friends because they worked in the same field. They shared meals, awards, and green room chatter. But Mike ignored it more and more, and it got worse. "I'd be cleaning out an attic and all of a sudden break down in tears," he told the jury, "because I knew, deep down I knew." Mike finally had enough when Rick tried to sue him for slander over a public conversation that had been leaked. "I would tell the truth if I was going down," he said. "Frank deserves that. Now we're seeing a reality TV star's mask fall off. It was Rick Harrison who bought and sold history. Now he's trying to change his own story." Fans held up signs outside the building as cameras flashed. There were posts that said "Justice for Frank" and "Mike, we believe you." Social media went crazy. Old videos are being watched again. Every grin or side eye that Rick gave was now seen as suspicious. There are questions being asked. People are asking for answers, and we're only just beginning, because what happened today in court was not the end of a story. It was the start of things coming apart. Truths that were hidden for decades under years of reality TV polish are now coming to light. There are links between Rick's business dealings and his questionable real estate deals. Has ties to a mysterious group of buyers. A network that might go further than anyone thought. However, it all starts here with one man, one tearful confession, and one terrible sentence. Frank was killed, that was him. Stay with us, because the truth behind this claim could destroy the reputation of Pawn Stars, reveal a secret war in the world of reality TV, and finally bring justice to a beloved star whose disappearance has been denied for a long time. A long time ago, it wasn't so hard back then, with the courtrooms, the charges, and the falling facades. That was the time when reality TV was still trying to figure out what it wanted to be, just like the stars were still trying to figure out who they were behind the camera and cut scenes. At first glance, Mike Wolfe and Rick Harrison looked nothing alike. Mike had that soft-spoken Iowa charm and a realness about him that made him easy to connect with. Rick, on the other hand, was as skeptical as nails. The kind of man who would scoff at a sob story but still try to get the price lowered. Still, these two built businesses in secret. Those powers were built on trust. People believed them. Buyers believed in them. They were looked for by collectors. Their shows, American Pickers and Pawn Stars, were about more than just pawn shops and old things. They were about people, American society, and the stories behind the things that were being bought and sold. At least that's what I saw. We now know that the truth was a lot more complex. When they were at their best, both shows were the most popular on the History Channel. Mike and Frank would drive all over the Midwest and go into barns, garages, and run-down buildings to find old gyms and lost memories. At the same time, Rick stayed strong at the gold and silver pawn shop in Las Vegas, where he dealt with strange things and people who were just as strange. The method worked for many years. People really liked it. A huge number of them tuned in. It all looked so real. On TV, though, Rob is often hidden under Polish. While cameras caught smiles, road trips, and funny chatter, things were getting worse. Some people, like Fritz, were already not happy with the way American Pickers was going. Crew members said in whispers that Frank often felt left out of creative decisions and that Mike was getting all the attention. They also said that the bond that fans loved on screen didn't quite match up with real life. Still, no one spoke out in public. There were contracts that had to be followed, steady paychecks, and fans that both men had to please. The show went on then. A lot of fans didn't know this, but Mike Wolfe and Rick Harrison's lives were becoming more and more linked. Even though they were in different shows, their private lives were starting to mix. The History Channel's producers, marketers, and executives began to pitch ideas for how to combine the two worlds through crossovers, co-branded events, and maybe even a joint spin-off show that would combine the picking and pawning franchises into one huge reality show. In early 2020, one of these ideas was put on the table for development. A Collector Kings special where Rick, Mike, and Frank would meet in Las Vegas to judge some of the strangest and most important things ever brought to TV. It was a great pitch. People who liked both shows would watch. It would go crazy on social media. It also meant that the History Channel would have even more power in the non-scripted business. It was almost certain to happen. It was just that not everyone agreed with it. Mike, who is always careful, raised early worries. It was said that he didn't like how the special felt. It didn't feel like American Pickers at all. It was too fake. Frank was interested, though. He saw it as a chance to get back on the show and maybe even do better than Mike in front of more people. The first talks looked good. Rick was all in. He worked very hard to get it. Emails from a producer that were shared show that Rick wrote, "Let's make it happen." At the time, that email didn't raise any red flags, but after what's come out recently, those words are scary. Rick and Frank started talking to each other more directly behind closed doors. Insiders say Frank flew to Las Vegas at least twice in 2021, supposedly to work out the details of the crossover, but we now know those meetings weren't official. What were they talking about? Based on private messages between Mike and a close friend, one theory is that Frank was working on a new deal behind Mike's back. It would be a solo show that would put Frank back in the spotlight and take him out from under Mike's shadow. And Rick, who turned his family's pawn shop into a media empire, would be the perfect person to help him do it. So the question is, was this working together a threat? Was Mike seeing it as betrayal? More importantly, was Rick seeing it as an opportunity? Because things went badly between those private meetings and the day Frank was hospitalized. Frank and Mike stopped talking to each other often. Frank's last few messages were shaky and suspicious, according to his friends. One of them said Frank left a voicemail late at night saying, "They're watching me." Rick is not who he says he is. Days later, that message was deleted from the recipient's phone in what was first thought to be a mistake. The court is now trying to decide. But in the weeks before the storm, the courtroom fight, and everyone found out about Mike's abuse and Rick's claimed part in it, things seemed normal. Rick kept filming, and Mike kept picking. The shifting tectonic plates under reality TV most popular shows were mostly ignored on social media. Even Frank's stroke was quietly swept under the rug. A short statement was released, and fans sent their best wishes. There were no updates after that, and then the rumors started. At first, they were small. Fans asked why no one from American Pickers visited Frank in public. There were no pictures, updates, or birthday wishes. It was very quiet. Rick sent a mysterious tweet saying that people disappear for a reason. It was deleted 2 hours later, but screenshots of it went viral. Then Mike started to pull away, at first in a subtle way. He got less press and didn't show up in public as much. But people who knew him said something had changed. Someone who used to work with Mike said he looked like he was carrying a secret that was too heavy for him to bear. It wasn't just grief, it was guilt. That's what makes this story so tragic and complicated. Real relationships were at stake before accusations were made and tears were shed on the witness stand. Frank and Mike were more than co-workers. They ate hot dogs at gas stations and laughed over midnight diner meals. Mike and Frank were more than co-workers, and even though Mike and Rick were different, they had shared moments that only reality TV veterans could understand. The pressure, the fame, the lies that millions of people believed became truths. It seemed like everything was fine, but that was just a mask. Masks can only stay on for so long before they fall off. We now know that behind the scenes there were investigations, rumors of power abuse, secret payments, and contracts signed under duress. There was a web of collusion that went from producers to talent managers to legal teams. At the center of it all were three men, one who was thought to be dead, one who was suspected of murder, and one who could not live with what he knew anymore. The storm was always coming. It just took time to gather. The silence, the secrecy, and the strange lack of openness weren't just random. They were part of a plan to hide the truth. One thing is becoming clear as this story goes on. Calm isn't always peace. Sometimes the stillness before destruction, the silence before a confession that shakes the courtroom to its core, is what makes things calm. Mike Wolfe was calm once. Until today, everyone thought Frank Fritz had a serious stroke. That was all anyone knew for sure at the time. A single sentence in a vague statement that read more like a lawyer's press release than a message of concern. Frank Fritz is currently recovering from a medical emergency. We ask that you respect his privacy. And with that, the man who had co-hosted more than 300 episodes of one of America's most beloved shows disappeared from the screen and from the conversation. Fans weren't sure what to think. Some were sad about Frank's absence and thought it was only temporary, while others started to guess. After all, Frank had always been honest about his problems. He'd talked about his battle with Crohn's disease, his time in rehab, and even a rough breakup. He never tried to hide the messy parts of his life. But this time there was nothing. At first, people were patient. A few weeks went by, then a few months. Still no updates. Frank's Instagram account, which used to be full of funny pictures and memories of road trips, went blank. The paparazzi never caught him in public, and none of his former co-stars, not even Mike Wolfe, said anything more than the scripted lines they were fed through the media. Someone who used to work as a production assistant posted anonymously on Reddit that the official story about Frank's condition wasn't telling the whole story. They said that Frank was in a much worse state than people thought. They said that Frank couldn't speak or move and was kept alone in a private facility where no one, not even family members, knew its location. More rumors spread. An anonymous former childhood friend of Frank's told a tabloid that he had been turned away when he tried to visit Frank in the hospital. They told me that Frank wasn't letting visitors in, but when I asked them which hospital he was in, they said they couldn't tell me. It didn't seem right, and fan groups on Facebook and YouTube started putting together what little evidence they had. One thread looked at audio cues from episodes before Frank left, suggesting that his voice had been edited to sound more energetic. Another video claimed to have found Frank's voice in a leaked voicemail recorded after the alleged stroke date, which made people wonder when or even if the stroke really happened. That being said, a worker at a Las Vegas pawn shop said they saw Frank in the back room of the gold and silver pawn shop just a few days before the official announcement of the stroke. The worker said Frank looked lost and angry, and that Rick Harrison was there with him, arguing in low voices. At the time, it was thought to be just another crazy internet rumor, but now that Mike Wolfe has testified in court, that event is being looked at again with a more serious eye. What really happened to Frank Fritz? The timing isn't clear, but let's try to put it together based on what we know now. Frank was in talks with Rick Harrison about a crossover project. maybe even a new show that was separate from American Pickers. Frank was excited about the idea because he felt like Mike and the producers of American Pickers had pushed him to the sidelines. This was his chance to get back into the spotlight, but this time he would have more creative freedom and a new audience. He flew to Las Vegas twice without making any public appearances or posting anything on social media. People close to him say he was very private about the trips. After his second trip, Frank stopped returning calls, so his friends thought he was again busy with personal matters. Short, vague texts like busy or all good were sent. Then the news came out that Frank had had a stroke and was in the hospital, but Mike Wolfe didn't feel right. He had known Frank for over 20 years and they had spent more time together on the road than with their own families. Mike later said that when he heard the news of Frank's stroke, it didn't feel like the truth. It felt like a smokescreen. In private, Mike started to look into things. He called hospitals, talked to mutual friends, and even hired a private investigator to find out where Frank was being treated. The investigator reportedly came back with disturbing information, including conflicting medical reports, sealed court documents, and most disturbingly, video surveillance footage from a facility where Frank was supposed to be recovering but never showed up. Mike's worst fears started to come true as he looked back at the events. The last known picture of Frank was taken at a diner in Las Vegas, just one day after he was supposed to have met Rick. Frank looked tired and thin, and his hands were shaking. The waitress who served him said that Frank barely touched his food and kept looking nervously at the door. The waitress told the police that Frank said something strange to her at the time. "If I'm not around next week, tell people Rick knows why." She didn't think much of it until she saw Frank's face on the news months later. Back in Iowa, Mike became more and more suspicious. Messages and emails from disposable accounts, phone calls with no caller ID, and even a typed note left at the front door of his store started coming to him. One message said, "Leave it alone. Don't become like him," she told him. But Mike couldn't get rid of the thought that something very bad had happened. A third-party law firm allegedly linked to Rick's business interests put pressure on Frank's family to sign a non-disclosure agreement. That firm is now being investigated. In court, Mike said he had been carrying a USB drive for months with backups of all the messages, photos, and digital clues he had been gathering. When he gave it to investigators, they started to piece together the scary truth that Frank's stroke may have been caused by foul play. There were differences in the medical records, important files had been changed, and someone was doing everything they could to make Frank disappear. The current theory is that Frank was poisoned or sedated with something strong enough to cause a stroke. Like state, not fatal, but enough to damage him permanently and make him unable to speak or testify. Was it to silence him? He not telling the public about a bad business deal? Was he being blackmailed? Did he know something he wasn't supposed to? The questions are still open, but the motive is beginning to take shape. Frank had always been a wild card. He drank and partied, and he talked too much when the cameras weren't rolling. If he really did know something bad about Rick Harrison or the group of antique dealers they worked with, he would be a liability that had to be taken care of. The hospital Frank was sent to has since declined multiple requests from the media for comment. The doctor who signed off on his medical report is said to have left the country, and Rick Harrison wouldn't talk about the rumors in public until Mike's testimony. Now that the case is public, no one knows what's going on with Frank. Some say he's alive but completely disabled, while others think he's already dead, and the story of his recovery is just a lie to keep people from looking into it. The truth may be hidden in sealed court documents or encrypted messages on hard drives, is now in the hands of the FBI. One thing that can't be argued with is that Frank Fritz didn't just have a stroke and disappear. Something terrible happened, and as more proof comes to light, it becomes clear that his disappearance from public life wasn't just a medical emergency. It was the start of a cover-up. This wasn't a famous person stepping down, it was a famous person being erased. And now Rick Harrison, the man who used to haggle over comic books and Civil War memorabilia, is being linked to something darker than anyone could have imagined. It's not that this part of the story ends. It leaves a hole that begs to be filled with answers. And as the investigation goes deeper, the question that stays isn't what happened to Frank Fritz. It's why was everyone told not to ask? Before anyone gasped in court, before cameras lined the steps of the courthouse, and before Mike Wolfe's shaking voice broke years of silence, a storm had already started to brew behind the scenes. The events that led to Mike Wolfe finally testifying against Rick Harrison didn't happen all at once. They happened slowly, creepingly, and with a growing sense of dread. Things that didn't make sense, like strange phone calls, doors that shut suddenly, and friends who used to talk quickly going eerily silent. Mike wasn't stupid. He knew how to read between the lines. He was a great picker because he could walk into a crumbling barn and tell you which dusty crate held treasure and which one held trash. This wasn't about antiques, though. It was about Frank, and nothing he saw or heard matched the clean story that was being told to the public. At first, Micah tried to stick to the company line. When fans asked for updates on Frank, he posted a carefully worded statement on social media saying that Frank is getting better. It was general enough to make the lawyers happy, but not so general that he couldn't hide his own unease. What he didn't say was that he hadn't seen or talked to Frank in months, and that all of his attempts to get in touch with him had been unsuccessful. At first, he thought Frank was just pulling away. They had drifted apart before, especially when things got tense on set, but this felt different. Frank wasn't just avoiding him, he had disappeared completely. His phone was disconnected, letters came back unopened, and mutual contacts said they hadn't heard from him either. Eventually, those contacts stopped returning Mike's calls too. Mike started his investigation during this time of enforced silence. At first, he did it quietly, going through old text messages, emails, travel logs, and anything else that might show where Frank had been or who he'd seen in the days before the supposed stroke. Rick Harrison's name kept coming up, and Mike knew Rick. Even though they weren't close friends, the reality TV world is a small one. They'd seen each other at events, shared green rooms, and even had a few drinks together at industry mixers. But what Mike found was scary. Records showed Frank had been to Las Vegas just days before his medical episode. What was even scarier was that Frank's costs on that trip, which included a fancy hotel suite, expensive meals, and a bunch of cash withdrawals, were supposedly paid for by a fake company that was later linked to a holding entity that was partly owned by Frank. The more Mike looked, the more things didn't seem to fit. Security footage from the hotel where Frank stayed was said to be down because of a problem with the system. A local ride-share driver who said he picked Frank up said he was crazy and kept mumbling something about people watching him. Then there were the legal papers. One morning, Mike got a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside were photocopies of legal papers, NDAs, waivers, and what looked like an emergency guardianship application filed in a Nevada court. Frank's signature was crossed out, but Mike knew it was Frank's right away, but it wasn't Frank's signature. He knew Frank's handwriting like the rust on an old Harley tank. The slant was off, the loops were too tight, it was a fake. Mike took the papers to his lawyer, who at first told him to be careful because these were serious charges. Anyone going public could be sued, counter-sued, and have their reputation hurt, but Mike didn't care. This wasn't about saving face, it was about protecting the truth. They hired a private investigator, and within weeks they found evidence that Frank may have been forced to sign away his medical decisions to a third party. Again, that third party was linked to Rick's network of businesses. The investigation grew. A tech expert was able to get back Frank's deleted messages from his cloud backup. One of them was a scary voice memo that said, "Mike, I think they're going to shut me up. Don't trust the guy with the Rolex, he knows." At first, no one knew who the man with the Rolex was, but later, A security guard at the gold and silver pawn shop confirmed that Rick always wore a certain Rolex, a limited edition model that was given to him at a promotional event years earlier and that Frank made fun of in an early crossover episode. When Mike had enough, he took the evidence to the police. At first, they didn't do much about it because Rick Harrison was well known for staying out of trouble with the law and had a lot of power. But as more evidence came in and anonymous sources spoke out, the investigation became official. Subpoenas were sent out, bank records were looked at, and communications between Rick and Frank's legal representatives were also looked at. Slowly, a case began to form of not only neglect, but also manipulation, coercion, and possibly criminal intent. That's when Rick made a big mistake. He sued Mike Wolfe before the walls came down, citing defamation. His business and personal reputation were being hurt by Mike's false claims that he had something to do with Frank's disappearance, according to Rick's filing. It was a brave but desperate move because Rick didn't realize that by filing the suit, he opened the door for discovery. Rick had been hiding records, files, and letters from Mike's legal team, but what they found changed everything. There were emails talking about how to keep the media from talking about Frank, and internal memos telling staff not to say anything about him unless they were legally forced to. It was a recording of a tense Zoom call leaked by an angry worker that showed a lawyer saying, "We just need to keep Frank quiet until the project clears." That recording was the turning point. Within days, the civil case turned into a criminal investigation, and Mike was asked to give a sworn statement. More witnesses came forward. When the FBI and state investigators finally got together, a grand jury was called together. The charges were very serious: obstruction of justice, fraud, conspiracy, and most horrifying of all, the idea that Frank had not been hurt accidentally but on purpose to keep him quiet. Even though the theory hadn't been proven yet, it was strong enough to warrant more research. Rick was subpoenaed and showed up with a legal team nearby. He was silent and stern, and he refused to answer most questions, citing his Fifth Amendment rights. But the damage had already been done. Public opinion changed overnight, and hashtags like #Justice for Frank and #WhatDidricto started trending on social media. Former cast and crew from both shows started making statements, some of which were vague and others were direct. Shumi, who used to be Rick's trusted assistant, wrote a mysterious message on Instagram: "Not everything you see on TV is real. Not everyone who smiles at you is a friend." The court date was set, and as soon as news outlets reported on it, the courtroom turned into a media circus. Protesters with signs showed up, and fans camped outside to catch a glimpse of Mike. Journalists swarmed the steps, eager for any new information. Finally, Mike Wolfe walked into court. He wore a simple dark suit and took the stand. His eyes were heavy with tiredness as he broke years of silence by talking about everything: the cover, Rups, the fake paperwork, the voicemail from Frank, the anonymous threats, the emails, the deleted footage, the fake documents, and the gut feeling that never left him. He then said it: Rick Harrison killed Frank Fritz. I don't know if he did it himself or through the people he hired, but I know he did it, and I'm not going to keep that a secret any longer. There was complete silence in the courtroom, so quiet it shook the building. The judge then called for order. The media rushed to report new information, and in a small town in the Midwest, a family watching a cracked TV screen started to cry. This wasn't just about TV anymore. It was about truth, justice, and finally answering the question that millions of people had been asking for years. When a famous person breaks their silence, it's usually through a press conference, an interview on TV, or a carefully worded social media post. But for Mike Wolfe, the truth didn't come from a PR team or an apology ready for the camera. It came from a bunch of handwritten pages, some on motel notepads and others in the margins of old travel brochures. These pages would become the key evidence against Rick Harrison. At least, the journal was never meant to be read by anyone else. Mike started writing it after Frank's supposed stroke, when the silence became too much to bear. The entries were raw, unfiltered, and sometimes rambling, but what they lacked in polish they made up for in intensity and emotional clarity. The man wasn't just dealing with grief, he was facing a truth that was too scary to say out loud. The journal entries, which have now been turned into evidence in court, show a man falling apart under the weight of secrets and suspicion. The first entry was made just 3 days after Mike learned that Frank was hospitalized. On March 18, they say Frank had a stroke, but something feels off. I don't know how to explain it, but it's like hearing a tune that's just a little off. You can't always put your finger on it, but you know something is wrong. The entries get more random after that, and Mike writes about his failed attempts to get in touch with Frank. He calls hospitals, tries to get in touch with common friends, and even sends a letter to Frank's sister, but never hears back. One particularly disturbing entry says, "I feel like I'm shouting into a canyon and hearing no echo. It sounds like he's already gone, but no one wants to say it." The tone changes. Mike starts to directly question the official story. He talks about a late-night call from an unknown number. The person on the other end didn't say who they were, but the message was clear. Don't dig too deep, let it go, he's better off this way. The call was never tracked. But Mike responded right away. He bought a small safe and started storing everything: emails, screenshots, voice messages, and the journal itself. The entries become less about the morning and more about keeping records. Mike starts keeping track of timelines, noting inconsistencies, and recording any conversation that seems fishy. He writes down names, dates, and even license plate numbers. For example, he writes, "Saw the same black SUV outside the shop again. It's happened 3 times this week." Tinted windows, out-of-state license plates, just sitting there watching. Mike wasn't crazy. He was starting to put together a story that no one else wanted to hear. Frank hadn't just had a medical emergency, but had been hurt on purpose. And what's worse, someone with power and influence had planned the whole thing. There's an entry from almost 6 months after Frank went missing that sounds like it came from a psychological thriller. September 4th, I had the dream again. Frank in that pawn shop back room, slouched in a chair, eyes wide open but not seeing anything. Behind me, I could hear Rick's voice. It was calm and almost bored. He should have kept his mouth shut. He says, "When I turn around, Rick isn't there. All I see is a mirror and I'm looking at myself." This is when Mike's emotions started to fall apart. His friends noticed that he was quieter and less willing to go out in public. Mike seemed less excited and involved in the show, and people thought he was just tired or bored. They had no idea he was fighting an inner battle. During this time, Mike's journal entries also show that he is struggling with guilt. He writes different versions of the same line over and over. He feels bad that he let Frank go to Vegas by himself and wonders why he didn't say anything sooner. "Maybe if I'd said something sooner," he writes, "they wouldn't have had the chance." But there's also defiance. As Mike starts to gather evidence, he uses the journal as both a guide and a way to protect himself. He knew that if something bad happened, the journal would tell the story. He made copies and hid them in different places. A few trusted people read parts of the journal. In one note, he writes, "If you're reading this, I probably didn't make it to court. Don't let them hide the truth from me." The log had grown to over 200 pages by the time the court case started. It had copies of papers, pictures of Frank from weeks before the stroke that don't show any signs of illness, and printouts of fishy financial transactions. One part of the journal has a list of names of people who are said to be friends with Rick Harrison. Some of these people have since been called in by investigators to be questioned. One of the most damning parts is when Mike talks about a private conversation he had with Frank a few weeks before the trip to Las Vegas. Frank said something strange that night. Mike wrote, "We were sitting on the tailgate drinking beers and watching the sun go down over an old barn." Frank said, "You ever feel like someone's writing your story for you and they just haven't told you how it ends? I laughed it off. Now I think he knew. I think he knew they were after him. The journal entries end all of a sudden in late 2022. There's no big reveal or grand finale. There's just a note in the margin of a gas station receipt that says going to court. No more hiding. It's time to speak out, and he did, at last. Mike took the stand. He held the journal in his hands. Copies had already been sent to the court, but he brought the original. As he read out loud from it, the room was silent. There were no interruptions or side conversations. It was just the honest words of a man who had spent years trying to carry the weight of what he knew. He didn't cry right away. He spoke slowly and clearly, like he was reliving an old episode of American Pickers. But when he got to the part about the dream where he sees himself in the mirror, his voice broke. He stopped, took a deep breath, and then said the words that changed everything. This book is for more than just me. It's for Frank. For those who think the truth is important, and for those who think they can't be touched because you can. The judge then called a break. Reporters gathered outside to post updates. The internet went crazy, but no one moved in the courtroom. There was no time for Rick Harrison to look up during the reading. His lawyers moved papers around, but the damage was already done. Mike Wolfe's secret journal had become the prosecution's most important piece of evidence, not just because it was full of facts, but also because it had a human side to it. At last, Mike Wolfe didn't feel like he had carry the weight of the world by himself for the first time in years. It was the kind of day that judges dread and court reporters dream of. The gallery was packed to the brim, and the press benches were overflowing. There was a tense silence in the air like a storm cloud. No one in that room was ready for how important what Mike Wolfe was about to say would be. It started quietly, with Mike walking to the witness stand with his eyes fixed on the ground while wearing a navy jacket over a black shirt. There were no cameras around like there usually are. There was no set of lights or script, just a wooden box, a microphone, and the man he was about to accuse. Rick Harrison sat at the defense table with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. He looked physically tired, but also in a way that only comes when a story you've worked years to control starts to fall apart around you. Mike swore. He sat down. He changed the mic. After that, he looked right at Rick. I didn't want to be here. His voice was low but clear when he spoke, but I could no longer handle this, not now that Frank's story is over. Everyone in the courtroom turned to look at that first phrase. Some pins stopped moving. Even the stenographer for the court took a moment to catch up. Mike then gave a timeline of events, including times, locations, and communications. This made the story seem less like a testimony and more like the revelation of a scary story that had been simmering under the surface of daytime TV. He talked about Frank's last call, which came the day before his second trip to Las Vegas. Mike said that Frank was unsure, nervous, and interested. Rick has a deal for me. Frank said it was big, really big. Mike told him not to go. It didn't feel right. Frank didn't care about it. They would never talk again after that. Mike talked about the days that came after, the reasons he heard when he tried to get in touch, and the answers that were late from people who usually answered in minutes. Everyone stopped talking about Frank like he was gone overnight. Then he talked about anonymous emails, the creepy surveillance footage from the pawn shop, and how the bosses at History Channel suddenly changed how they dealt with any mention of Frank. They seemed to want to forget about him, Mike said. He said, like he'd become a liability. The lawyer then asked him directly what he meant. Based on the information you've given me today, Mr. Wolfe, what do you think happened to Frank Fritz? Mike looked around the room, took a deep breath, and leaned in a little closer to the mic. What I think happened to Frank was done by Rick Harrison. I think he set it in motion, whether he did it himself or told other people how to do it. Frank may have been shut up because he knew something that wasn't okay for him to know. Gasp was all over the hall. The judge hit the gavel. Reporters sped through the computers. It was the event that would be all over the news across the country by evening. Mike didn't end there. After that, he talked about a night a few months after Frank had gone missing. A night when he got a paper envelope at his store. There is no return address. There was one flash drive inside. On it, there is a 23-second movie. A fuzzy video clip of Frank in what looked like the gold and silver pawn shop's back office, slouched in a chair, eyes wide and not paying attention. Even though his mouth moved, he didn't make a sound, and Rick's words in the background, "Don't stress, this will end soon." The court was quiet again. Mike said that he had given the video to the police right away. The metadata showed that it was recorded 2 days before Frank was taken to the hospital, but its accuracy was still being checked by forensics. Then the most moving part of the day happened. Mike was asked by the lawyer to describe the last thing that made him sure that Rick was involved. "He told me that," Mike replied. "We were behind the scenes at a networking event about 2 years ago. First we were just chatting, but then Rick said, 'Funny thing about Frank. Some people don't know when to shut up until life teaches them the hard way.' I didn't think much of it at the time. I thought Rick was just being Rick. After everything that's happened, though, that line keeps coming back to me." Mike shook his head when asked if he talked to Rick after that. "I was scared. I didn't know anyone else who was engaged. I had already been told by more than one unnamed person to keep quiet by that point." In the end, the defense team got up to cross-examine. To make Mike look like a troubled person, they said he was feeling bad about kicking Frank off the show. They were skeptical about the timing and the fact that there was no physical proof linking Rick to any crime. Mike wouldn't move, though. He stayed cool, clear, and determined. He said, "I'm not here to guess. I will share what I know, what I have seen, and what I think took place. It's okay if that makes me look crazy. I'd rather be called crazy than keep quiet and let Frank's story die with him." Rick Harrison didn't say a word during the whole statement. He sometimes whispered to his lawyer, but he never showed any emotion. There was no shaking of the head or anger that could be seen. He just stared blankly at the man who was destroying his reputation word by word. The judge called a break after almost 4 hours. Mike quit. No one in the crowd cheered or applauded. Now, there were only the quiet whispers of people who had just heard a man say something most people would never dare say. A craze had broken out outside the courts. The news crews yelled questions. People protested with signs. People who liked Frank Fritz cried. In the middle of it all, Mike Wolfe walked quietly to his car while being accompanied by officers. With each step, the weight of what he had just done sank deeper into his shoulders. He had shown the man the finger and named him. He also messed up one of the most closely watched machines in reality TV by doing that. But more than anything else, he had given people who couldn't speak a voice. Frank Fritz wasn't just a co-host, a sidekick, or a funny figure to Mike. He was a friend and a brother in spirit. To respect him, he finally broke the silence, faced his fears, and told the world the unthinkable truth. It was painful and powerful. There was more to this story than what was said in court. It was the first sign that it was falling apart. After Rick's case fell apart and public opinion quickly changed, the trial was no longer about what could have happened to Frank Fritz. The goal was to prove it beyond a reasonable question and hold someone responsible for the long period of silence that followed his disappearance. In court, a claim is only stronger if it has strong evidence to back it up. Eyewitness accounts can make you feel strongly, but hard proof that can't be argued with, is time-stamped, and can be tracked down, can put an end to any doubts. In this case, the courtroom went from murmurs and gasps to a chilling silence as the prosecution showed proof that Rick Harrison was connected to Frank Fritz's strange death. The government did not hurry. They worked carefully, piece by piece, putting together a story that wasn't based on guesses but on digital, financial, and visual records. The case wasn't about rumor. It had to do with a list of events, a pattern, and a path that seemed to grow closer to Rick Harrison every minute. CCTV video was the first thing that was used to attack. Earlier news stories said that footage from the hotel where Frank stayed had suddenly vanished, but that was only partly true. The hotel had to give up backup security data because they were served with a subpoena. At first, their IT team said it couldn't be done. But forensic techs working for the prosecution were able to get pieces of video from secondary storage units that hadn't been properly erased. What they found was fuzzy but devastating. In a video from 3 nights before he was hospitalized, Frank is seen walking clumsily into the hotel lobby with 2 men standing on either side of him. One of the men was later identified as a friend of Rick Harrison through face recognition. The name of the other man is being kept secret by the court, but this is clear. Frank wasn't in charge of what he was doing. His arms were down, his eyes looked like they were made of glass, and the experts who were called in to look at the video say that he was either in a lot of pain or heavily drugged. A second video clip from the hotel parking lot showed Rick Harrison's unique car pulling in just minutes after Frank did. It was a black Escalade with custom wheels and a sticker on the back bumper that could be seen. Rick wasn't mentioned as a guest, and he never said anything about going to the property. Still, it was clear that the car records and license plate match were real. Not formally, he wasn't supposed to be there, and then there were the texts. Investigators using digital forensics were able to get a partial version of Frank's old phone. A lot of files were lost or damaged, but there were still a few important text exchanges left. Frank went missing just hours before this message was sent to an unknown number. It said, "I don't trust Rick, something's off. If I don't show up tomorrow, it's because I said no." Later that same night, another message just said, "I think this is it." The prosecutors said that Frank's words, "this is it," showed that he thought something terrible was about to happen, along with the message that Wolfe got. Frank's voice shook as he said, "Don't trust the guy with the Rolex." Frank knows that the messages showed a man who thought he was going into danger and didn't expect to come out of it. The authorities say that fear was not paranoia. It was being grateful. After that, an analysis of financial activities was given to the court. Investigators had spent months going through Frank's bank records to find anything that didn't seem right. Even experienced financial experts were shocked by what they found. And $85,000 payment was sent from one of Frank's personal accounts to a Nevada-based shell company just 3 days before he went to the hospital. Frank had never talked about that kind of business deal. That business didn't have a website, staff, or a real address. It only had a P.O. box that is linked to a mail transfer service in Las Vegas. As the investigation went on, it was found that account that received the money was directly linked to a business that Rick Harrison owned with 2 other people. One of them was the man who was seen on the security video getting Frank into the hotel. It was said that the deal was a coaching fee for help with the development of a new show. There was never a show pitch, no contracts were ever signed, and Frank's reps said he never agreed to such a payment. Either it was fake or someone forced them to make it. Then there was what many people now call the smoking gun. In the courtroom, a copy of an email that was received through legal discovery was shown on a screen. It was Rick Harrison who sent it. The receiver was an executive at a TV network whose name will not be released. The subject line of the email was easy to understand. Issue with Frank. The email's body read, "Take care of it. He's a weak spot. Use anyone you want. Do it in silence, please." Right away, Rick's lawyers said that the email had been taken out of context, and that handle could have meant a lot of different things. They also said that the message had been sent months earlier during a heated contract fight. But the date and time of the email, which came just 6 days before Frank's strange trip to Las Vegas, made that argument look very weak. It hit hard when someone said, "Get it done quietly." It was felt by everyone in the hall. A forensic toxicologist was then called to the stand by the lawyers. This expert looked over Frank's hospital records, which had been sealed until lately. The toxicologist said that Frank's first blood test showed that he had unusually high amounts of benzodiazepines. Benzodiazepines are a group of drugs that includes sedatives like Valium and Xanax. If you take too much of these drugs or mix them with booze, they can kill you. But what's more important is that they can also cause signs like a stroke, like slurred speech, loss of motor function, and confusion. This was one way for someone to fake a medical emergency without leaving clear proof. Now for the twist. Frank did not have a prescription for that kind of medicine. 2 huge red flags went up when this finding came out. At first, it looked like Frank might have been high. Second, it meant that someone close to him, who could have gotten the drugs into his system through his drinks, food, or environment. The courtroom was shocked into silence as the toxicologist talked about how the doses found in Frank's body were too high to have been accidental. They had to be planned and given in a controlled environment. The expert came to the conclusion that there was foul play because of when the dose was given, what the drugs were, and how quickly Frank got worse. Then there was the physical proof. A fake phone was found in Rick's office safe, found when the pawn shop was searched by the court. The device didn't have much information on it, but there were still a few texts left. 2 of them said, Make sure Wolfe doesn't see him. One said, "It's done." He won't be talking. It was impossible to say for sure who sent the messages, but the phone was linked to a burner purchase made under an alias that had been used in past business dealings with Rick. The defense said the phone wasn't Rick's, but months earlier, video footage from the pawn shop showed Rick taking the same phone out of his jacket pocket during a staff meeting. Things were getting close for him in the case. To back up their case, the authorities called a former worker at the pawn shop who had worked closely with Rick during the time in question. Under the oath of silence, the witness said Rick had once told him, "You didn't see anything and you won't say anything. Remember that Vegas keeps its secrets if you do that." The witness said he was scared. After a few weeks, he quit his job. Finally, prosecutors showed internal papers that showed Rick had recently increased the insurance policy on his production company, specifically because of the risk of injury or death to talent. The policy that was bought just 2 weeks before Frank went to the hospital had an unusual clause for people who don't do what they agreed to do. When asked why they added that clause, Rick's team didn't say anything. It had been a long trip that not many people saw coming by the time the prosecution took a break. What began as a few vague ideas had turned into a mountain of direct and indirect proof. There are piece dams and threads that all point in the same way. The tough exterior of Rick Harrison was starting to break down. He didn't seem as sure of himself or calm as before. A lot more often, he looked at his lawyers. He pulled his eyes away from the jury. The fact that he stopped looking at Mike Wolfe may have been the most telling sign. There was a lot of proof. It became clear to everyone in the room when the judge called for a break. It was no longer about what Frank Fritz might have done. In order to be sure that Frank was not being heard, this had to be proven beyond a reasonable question. As of now, public evidence shows that Rick Harrison was not the only one participating. He was in the middle of everything. Rick Harrison didn't look like the person who made a living negotiating with charm and precision on national TV. His defense started to fall apart under the weight of too much proof. This wasn't the smooth, talking, funny businessman that everyone had seen on Pawn Stars for years. This person looked like they were in a tight spot, on guard and alone. As the days went by in court, another layer was taken off of the carefully built persona that millions of people had faith in. And as the most important part of the hearing began, Rick's lawyers started to fall apart under the stress. At first, Rick's lawyers tried to brush off the accusations as ridiculous and without any evidence. They said that Mike Wolfe's statement was based on emotional guesswork. They said that the security footage didn't show anything clear. The digital messages were missing parts, and the toxicology reports came at a handy time. But as the prosecution presented fact after fact, each one backed up by forensic experts, financial analysts, and informants, the defense's case started to fall apart. When they hit first, the court allowed the damaging email Rick sent to a network executive, which was called Frank Problem. The defense fought hard to keep the message from being shown, saying it was taken out of context and should be kept secret under executive-client privilege. However, after days of meetings, the judge finally let it be shown in its entirety. "Handle it. He's a liability. Use whoever you need, just get it done quietly." The words showed up on the screen in the courtroom. The mood of the judges changed in a way that could be heard. Faces got tighter. A few of the members moved around in their seats. After that, Rick's lawyers could not get the meanings of that digital smoking gun out of their heads. In response, Rick's main lawyer, a gray-haired lawyer with a history of high-profile cases, changed tactics and started attacking Rick's character. They tried to make Mike Wolfe look bad. They brought up a statement from years ago in which Mike lost his cool over a business dispute. In Mike's book, they talked about how unstable he was emotionally, saying that he might have a savior complex and be projecting his guilt onto Rick. The defense lawyer said, "This is a man filled with regret. But sorrow alone is not proof of murder." If what happened the next day hadn't happened, that line would have hit harder. A woman named Linda Mayhew, who used to work as an assistant for one of Rick's business bosses, testified for the prosecution. Linda had kept quiet for years because she was afraid of getting in trouble and was bound by NDA. But after getting immunity, she went on the stand and said that Rick's inner group was toxic, based on fear and manipulative. She told the judge that Rick had once told her, "Frank is talking too much. It might be time to end his side job." She said at the time that she thought it was a metaphor, but now that she thinks about it, she's not so sure. The timetable that the lawyers had made fit perfectly with what she said. She even said that the burner phone that was found in Rick's office existed and that she had been told to charge it and not talk about it again. That one statement caused a lot of trouble in Rick's camp. After Linda's statement, 2 junior defense lawyers are said to have fought behind closed doors. Leaked insider reports say that there was disagreement over what to do next, whether to keep denying or think about a plea deal. Rick said no. He insisted on sticking to the original plan because he was sure he could still talk and move his opponents around like he did with so many buyers on Pawn Stars. But courts aren't places to negotiate. When the price is fair, there's no need to make an offer. The next big hole in Rick's defense was the proof about his money. When the prosecutors brought in a forensic accountant to look into the $85,000 move Frank had made to the fake company linked to Rick, the defense tried to say that Frank had freely agreed to the terms of the deal. But when they were asked to show proof like emails, contracts, or messages, there was none. There were no signs of a deal, no signed papers, and nothing with Frank's marks or approval. Then authorities showed something very bad about the case. The signature on the permission for the wire transfer had been changed digitally. A handwriting expert who was brought in as a neutral third party said that the signature had key differences that didn't match Frank's usual way of writing. The PDF file's information also showed that the signature was added from an IP address that belonged to an office that worked with Rick's production team. At this point, the judge had to stop the proceedings for a few minutes to deal with the loud responses in the courtroom. Reports say that one member shook their head in shock. Someone else was seen biting their nails. The defense team tried something risky by saying that Rick wasn't directly involved with the money deal. They said it was the fault of a bad employee, a mistake by the staff, or that someone on the team might have done something without Rick's knowledge. But when they were pushed further, they couldn't name the alleged bad guys. They also couldn't figure out why Rick had never brought up this option in earlier depositions or interviews. The public's opinion was quickly shifting online. It became popular to use hashtags like #RickThakeser and #Pawncars. People who used to watch the show posted videos of themselves putting away Pawn Stars stuff. YouTube users started to look at old videos again to see if there were any signs of guilt or manipulation. Rick laughed during an episode and said, "Trust is expensive and rarely worth the price." This quote would be used over and over on signs outside the building, in news headlines, and even in a documentary that was already being made about the trial. Back in court, Rick's behavior was getting worse. He didn't look calm anymore. He slouched down even more in his chair. He often whispered to his lawyers, and sometimes he was angry. He dropped a pin and didn't pick it up at one point. There was no longer any faith. Then there was the last public split. In a shocking move, the prosecution played a private recording made by one of Rick's former workers. It is said that Rick told a small group of trusted staff at a post-production party Fritz was a ticking time bomb. He wanted to blow it all up, but I made sure he didn't get the chance. The defense complained right away, saying that the tape violated their privacy, but the judge let the whole thing play for the jury. It was easy to recognize Rick's voice. The tone was jokey and almost proud. His voice belonged to a man who was in charge and wanted everyone to know it. It was a very different mood in the courtroom when the prosecution finally rested their case. Rick's defense had fallen apart, and not just formally. It had also fallen apart emotionally and mentally. His lawyers had no more things to do. They used every reasonable argument against it, every possible rival theory, and every character dig they could find. Not a single thing stuck. Now they only had one buyer left who wouldn't admit the walls were closing in. Rick asked to take the stand himself as a last, desperate attempt to get back in charge. Even though his lawyers told him not to, he stood in front of the jury and said he was innocent. He told himself that Mike Wolfe was just a jealous friend and that he was the target of a witch hunt. He said that the witnesses were not clear, the evidence was fake, and the court procedures were an insult to justice. It was too late, though. The words didn't mean anything. He sounded angry and defensive, and he wasn't persuasive. What should have been his chance to fix his image turned out to be the start of his downfall. The cross-examination was very rough. The police played back what he had said. They picked apart his inconsistencies. They asked why. Frank didn't just back out of the deal if he was a risk. Instead, he lied about it. Rick didn't know what to say. It was louder than any statement that he kept quiet. By the end of that week, people in the courtroom knew what was going to happen. It was no longer a question of whether Rick's argument would work. It had already broken down. It wasn't about whether Rick Harrison was guilty anymore. It was about when the jury would agree with what everyone else already thought.